The evening air over Savannah, Georgia hung thick and warm, the way it always did in late September, when the last breath of summer refused to let go. The cobblestone streets of the historic downtown district caught the amber glow of the old gas-style lampposts, and the Spanish moss that draped from the live oaks swayed almost imperceptibly in the faint, humid breeze. It was the kind of night that made people slow down, the kind of night that felt like it meant something. Inside Hargrove's Chop House, the city's most distinguished restaurant tucked into the ground floor of a pre-Civil War building on Abercorn Street, the world was quiet in the way that only expensive places can be. The clink of sterling silverware against fine bone china, the murmur of low conversation between people who never raised their voices because they had never needed to. The soft, unhurried movement of servers in pressed white jackets, carrying trays of bone-in ribeyes and bottles of wine that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Crystal chandeliers cast everything in warm amber. The mahogany-paneled walls absorbed the light and gave it back softer the way old wood does. This was a place where senators and shipping magnates and retired generals came to broker deals over long dinners, where the power of this city had been quietly negotiated for over a century. And in the corner booth, half hidden in the gentle shadow of a brass table lamp, sat Marcus Webb. He appeared to anyone glancing casually in his direction like a man perfectly at ease. His hands rested lightly on either side of his sparkling water glass. A half-eaten plate of she-crab soup sat to his left, still steaming faintly in the cool, conditioned air. He wore a charcoal suit that fit with the kind of precision that does not come off a rack, and his tie was the deep blue of a midnight ocean. But if you watched him long enough, and very few people did, you would notice something else entirely. His eyes never stopped moving, not anxiously, not nervously. The way a man moves his eyes when the habit has been burned into him by years of operating in places where a single lapse of attention meant he did not come home. Marcus Webb was 41 years old. He had spent the last 14 years as a Special Forces officer in the United States Army attached to units whose names did not appear in press releases. He had led men through the mountain passes of Afghanistan in temperatures that cracked the skin on your hands. He had directed operations in the jungle corridors of Central America where the enemy moved like smoke. He had come home from each of those places quieter than when he left, carrying things that had no names, but settled behind his eyes and never fully left. The only physical trace of any of it was a faint, narrow scar along the inside of his right wrist, pale against his dark skin from a night outside Kandahar 12 years ago that he did not talk about. Tonight, none of that existed. Tonight was a celebration. He was waiting for General Raymond Cole, his commanding officer, his mentor, the man who had written every letter of recommendation that had shaped the arc of Marcus Webb's career for the past decade and a half. Cole had stepped away from the table 20 minutes ago to take a secure call from the Pentagon in the lobby. The promotion to 05 had been formally approved 3 days prior. Tonight's dinner was the ritual acknowledgement of that. Two men who had served together across more years and more theaters of operation than either of them liked to count, sitting down to a quiet meal in the finest restaurant in the city they both called home. Marcus picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and let his eyes move once around the room. Force of habit. He catalogued exits, sight lines, the positions of the servers, the couple at the adjacent table who had been arguing in whispers for the last 10 minutes, the older gentleman in the tweed jacket near the window reading a newspaper with the careful patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. Everything was exactly as it should be. He set the glass down, unfolded his napkin, and allowed himself for just a moment to feel something close to peace. 3 blocks away, the atmosphere inside Patrol Car 714 was nothing remotely like peace. Officer Derek Pruitt sat behind the wheel with the engine idling, and his thick fingers drumming a slow, irritable rhythm against the top of the steering wheel. He was 44 years old. 14 years on the Savannah Police Department, and in those 14 years he had accumulated exactly the kind of record that should have ended a career long before it did. 11 formal complaints. 3 use-of-force reviews. 2 settlements paid quietly by the city to individuals who had been brave enough or desperate enough to put their names on a piece of paper and describe what Derek Pruitt had done to them. Every single one of those complaints had been buried, filed, reviewed, and then quietly absorbed into the bureaucratic machinery of a police union that was very good at making inconvenient truths disappear into subcommittee reports that nobody ever read. Pruitt knew this. He had watched it happen every time, and that knowledge had done something to him over the course of 14 years. It had convinced him on a level so deep he could no longer examine it that he was untouchable, that the badge on his chest was not a symbol of public trust, but a personal guarantee of immunity, that the streets of this city belonged to him, and the people on them were there at his discretion. He was a man who craved authority the way a starving person craves food. Not because authority made him better at his job, but because wielding it was the only thing that ever made him feel like he mattered. The radio crackled to life. Dispatch to all units in the downtown sector. We have a report of a grand larceny in progress at Whitmore Jewelers on Congress Street. Suspect is described as a black male, approximately 6 feet, wearing dark clothing. Last seen heading northbound on foot. All units in the area, please respond. Pruitt's fingers stopped drumming. He leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening, and listened to the description again in his own head. Black male, dark clothing, downtown. He looked out the windshield at the quiet stretch of Abercorn Street in front of him. The lampposts, the cobblestones, the warm amber glow spilling out of the tall windows of Hargrove's Chop House 50 yards ahead. He had driven past that restaurant 100 times. He had never once eaten there. The kind of place he could not afford, frequented by the kind of people who had always made him feel, without ever saying a word, like he was standing on the wrong side of a velvet rope. His eyes moved to the nearest window of the restaurant, scanning the interior through the glass. And then he saw him, a tall black man in a dark suit, sitting alone at a corner booth. Pruitt's chest filled with something he would have called professional instinct, but was nothing of the kind. He threw the cruiser into drive. He did not call the description in for verification. He did not radio dispatch to confirm the location of other units. He did not check whether the description of the actual suspect included anything more specific than black male, dark clothing. He pulled forward, swung the cruiser into the red zone directly in front of Hargrove's Chop House, and killed the engine. He adjusted his duty belt. The leather creaked under his hands. He checked his reflection once in the rearview mirror the way men do when they are about to do something they have already decided to do. Then he pushed open the door and walked toward the restaurant. The transition from the warm September night outside to the hushed interior of Hargrove's Chop House was immediate and absolute. The noise of the street disappeared. The air changed. The temperature dropped several degrees. The host, a meticulously groomed man named Franklin, stepped forward from his station. Immediately, his smile professional, his eyes moving to the duty belt and the badge with the practiced calm of someone who understood that a police officer walking into a fine restaurant usually meant one of 2 things, neither of them simple. "Good evening, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" "Police business. Step aside." Pruitt did not look at him. He was already moving past the hostess stand, his heavy tactical boots thudding against the plush carpet with a deliberate weight that was not incidental. It was a sound designed to be heard, to interrupt, to announce dominance before a single word had been spoken. Several of the nearest tables looked up. Conversations paused. A server, who had been moving between tables, stopped and stood very still, a tray balanced on one hand, watching. Pruitt's eyes swept the room. He moved past the older white men in golf shirts and blazers, past the women in cocktail dresses leaning in over their wine, past the tables of people who looked in his habitual calculus like they belonged exactly where they were. His eyes found Marcus Webb in the corner booth. Dark suit, tall, sitting alone. That was all Pruitt needed. He adjusted his posture, squared his shoulders, and began the long walk across the dining room floor. He did not notice the way Marcus's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly toward him the instant he began moving. He did not notice the way Marcus placed both hands flat on the white linen tablecloth, visible, deliberate, and waited. He did not notice the faint glow of a smartphone screen rising at a table near the back, or another near the window, or a third from the couple who had stopped arguing and were now watching something else entirely. Pruitt stopped at the edge of Marcus's table. He planted his feet wide. His right hand came to rest near the butt of his service weapon, a gesture so ingrained it had become unconscious. "Excuse me." His voice was loud enough to carry clearly over the soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers. It was not a greeting. It was a command. Marcus looked up. His expression was completely neutral. Not afraid, not angry, simply present. The way a man is present when he has spent years training his body not to betray what his mind is doing. "Good evening, officer. Can I help you? I need to see some identification." Marcus's brow moved a fraction of an inch. "May I ask why?" "You match the description of a suspect in an armed robbery up on Congress Street. ID now." A silence fell over the nearest section of the restaurant. Real silence. The kind that spreads outward from a point like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Marcus did not reach for his wallet. He folded his hands together on the table, his posture easy, his voice measured and precise. "Officer, I have been seated at this table for approximately 50 minutes. Franklin at the host station can confirm my arrival time. My server, Thomas, can confirm it as well. I ordered the she-crab soup, and I am waiting for the rest of my party to return from the lobby. I have not been near any jewelry store this evening. Pruitt's face flushed. He hated this. He hated the calm. He hated the complete, unhurried competence of it. He hated that the man sitting in front of him was not afraid that he was speaking clearly and precisely, and citing witnesses by name that he was doing everything right, and doing it without a single tremor of submission. "I don't care what you claim you've been doing. I'm conducting an active investigation, your ID, right now." "Officer," Marcus's voice dropped slightly. It did not get louder, it got quieter. And somehow that was worse. "Unless you are detaining me on the basis of a specific articulable suspicion, I am not required to produce identification while I am seated in a private establishment having dinner." Am I being detained? The question hung in the air between them. Am I being detained? Pruitt's jaw locked. The tendons in his neck stood out against his collar. The entire left side of the restaurant was watching now. He could feel it. The weight of those eyes on him. The glow of the phone screens he had not yet registered consciously, but that his body understood on some animal level. He could not back down. Not now. Not in front of all of these people, not to this man. You're being a smart mouth. You think sitting in a nice restaurant means the law doesn't apply to you. I said you match the description. That gives me the right to identify you. A generic description of a black man in a dark suit in a city of nearly 200,000 people. Marcus replied, his voice unchanged, does not constitute reasonable, articulable suspicion. sufficient for a Terry stop. Furthermore, my presence here is well documented by the staff and by the security cameras in this lobby. If you would like to speak to the manager to verify my arrival time, you are welcome to do so. Otherwise, I would appreciate being allowed to finish my dinner in peace. Something broke behind Pruitt's eyes. He reached down. His fingers found the leather snap that secured his handcuffs to his belt. The metallic clink of the snap releasing was extraordinarily loud in the silence of the restaurant. "Stand up. You are under arrest." Marcus did not move. He looked at Pruitt with an expression that was not fear, not even anger exactly. It was something more devastating than either. It was pity. On what charge? Obstruction of a police investigation and resisting detainment. I said, "Get on your feet. If I have to physically remove you from that booth, I will add assault of an officer to the list. Now, stand up." The restaurant was completely still now. The jazz had not stopped playing, but nobody could hear it anymore. Servers stood motionless. Franklin, the host, was at the far end of the room with a phone pressed to his ear, his face pale, speaking very quietly to someone. Marcus remained seated. His hands were still flat on the tablecloth. Visible, deliberate. A man who had operated in war zones against people who genuinely wanted to kill him was not going to flinch in front of a local cop having a tantrum in a steakhouse. He had fought trained combatants in mountain passes in the dark. He had held a perimeter for 11 hours with 4 men against a force 3 times their size. Officer Derek Pruitt, with his bruised ego and his leather duty belt, was barely a blip on the radar of everything Marcus Webb had walked through to be sitting at this table tonight. "I suggest you think very carefully," Marcus said, "about the next move you make. You are about to cross a line you will not be able to walk back from." Pruitt laughed. It was an ugly sound, short and hard. The laugh of a man who has never been held accountable for anything he has ever done and genuinely cannot conceive of a world in which he might be. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, pal." And he reached forward. His hand moved toward the front of Marcus's jacket, the thick fingers spreading, intending to grab the lapel, intending to haul this man physically across the table and put him on the floor in front of everyone in this restaurant, and remind every single person watching exactly who ran these streets. His fingers were 6 inches from the fabric, and then the light changed. A shadow fell across the table. Not a small shadow, a massive one. The kind that comes from a very large man standing very close behind you. And then the voice. It was a deep, unhurried baritone. The kind of voice that had given orders in classified briefings. The kind of voice that had stood in front of Senate committees. The kind of voice that had on 3 separate occasions spoken directly into the ear of the President of the United States. It did not shout. It did not need to. "Son," 1 word. "I strongly suggest you remove your hand." Pruitt froze. His fingers hovered in the air 6 inches from the fabric of Marcus's jacket and did not move. He turned, slowly. He turned because some part of his nervous system had already registered the size of the presence behind him, the weight of the silence that had accompanied it, the way the entire room seemed to have shifted its center of gravity toward the man who had just spoken. He turned and found himself looking up into the pale blue eyes of General Raymond Cole. Retired, technically. 4 stars, absolutely. Cole was 67 years old and stood 6 feet 3 inches tall. He was dressed in a dark civilian suit impeccably cut, and he wore a small lapel pin just below his left breast pocket. 1 gold anchor, 4 silver stars. Pruitt stared at that pin. He had spent 14 years in municipal law enforcement. He had never served in the military. He knew almost nothing about the upper echelons of the United States Armed Forces. But every human being in the United States who has ever opened a newspaper or watched a presidential press conference knows what 4 stars means. Pruitt knew. He felt it before he understood it the way you feel cold water, before you have processed that you are drowning. The color drained from his face so completely and so quickly that the couple at the adjacent table actually exchanged a glance. His hand, which had been reaching for Marcus Webb's jacket, dropped to his side. The handcuffs dangled from his other hand. They felt like they weighed 40 pounds. Cole stepped forward. Not aggressively. Not in a rush. He closed the distance between himself and Pruitt with the measured certainty of a man who has never had to hurry to make a point. He stopped when he was close enough that Pruitt had to tilt his chin up slightly to maintain eye contact. "You have exactly 30 seconds. Cole set his voice a quiet, terrifying rumble to explain to me why you are attempting to unlawfully detain one of the most decorated special operations officers in the United States Army during his private celebratory dinner. Pruitt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Not a word, not a syllable. His vocal cords had simply stopped functioning under the weight of what he was looking at. Because General Raymond Cole was not just a tall man with stars on his lapel. He was the kind of man who carried authority not in the things he wore, but in the way he occupied space. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and every other person in that room would know without being told that someone with real power had arrived. Pruitt had spent 14 years performing authority for people who had less power than he did. He had never, in his entire career, been in the presence of someone who genuinely had more. He matches a description, sir. Grand larceny, up on Congress Street. I was conducting a standard Terry stop. Cole's eyes did not change. They did not widen. They did not narrow. They simply looked at Pruitt with a kind of clarity that made the officer feel like every word he had just said was being dissected and weighed and found wanting. "Do not," Cole said, "insult my intelligence. And do not attempt to conceal your prejudice behind the language of procedure." He glanced at Marcus, then back at Pruitt. "I returned to this table 7 minutes ago and observed the entirety of your interaction. Commander Webb has been seated in this booth for the better part of an hour. The host knows it. The server knows it. The security cameras in that lobby know it. And you knew it, or would have known it, if you had done anything resembling an investigation instead of walking in here looking for someone to humiliate." Pruitt's chest was heaving. His face, which had been pale, was now cycling through colors with the efficiency of a man whose body was trying and failing to choose between fight and flight, and finding neither option available. "I was acting on the dispatch," he managed. "You were acting on the fact," Cole interrupted, his voice dropping lower, "that you saw a black man in an expensive restaurant and decided he did not belong here. You ignored his explanation. You ignored the basic constitutional requirements of the stop you were attempting, and you were about to put your hands on him." Pruitt looked around the room. The phone screens. There were so many of them now, at least 8 that he could count, all aimed at him. The maitre d' Franklin had positioned himself near the front door, not blocking it, just present, making it unmistakable that nothing in this room was going to disappear quietly into the night. Pruitt's hand moved to his radio. He was going to call for backup. He was going to call his supervisor. He was going to call anyone who might arrive and provide him with cover with an institutional buffer, with the familiar comfort of the blue wall that had always materialized around him before when things got difficult. "I'm calling for a supervisor," he said, grabbing the radio mic. "We have a non-compliant suspect and a civilian interfering with an active investigation." Cole watched him reach for the radio. "An interfering civilian." He repeated the words with a quiet that was somehow more devastating than any shout. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. For one terrible fraction of a second, Pruitt's hand moved toward his weapon. Pure training. Pure reflex. Marcus shifted his weight on the booth seat, almost imperceptibly. But Cole saw it, and Pruitt felt it, that subtle molecular rearrangement of a man who has spent years preparing for exactly this moment, and has absolutely no intention of letting it escalate, but will not be caught unprepared if it does. Cole did not pull out anything threatening. He pulled out a phone. Slim, government-issued, with one number on speed dial. "You want a supervisor, officer," Cole said. His eyes were still completely steady. "Let's get you a supervisor, though I think we can aim considerably higher than a desk sergeant." He put the phone to his ear. The silence in the restaurant was so complete that the couple at the next table could hear clearly and without straining the sound of the line ringing on the other end. "Yes. This is General Raymond Cole. Connect me to Chief Ronald Stokes, his personal cell. Yes, I am aware it is a Friday evening. Tell him it is an emergency involving one of his patrol officers who is currently attempting to assault a federal officer inside a civilian establishment." Pruitt's stomach turned to ice. Chief Ronald Stokes, chief of police for the entire city of Savannah. He was not a man you called at 8 o'clock on a Friday night and expected forgiveness. He was not a man who received calls like this and sent a supervisor in response. Pruitt understood in the next several seconds that the universe of possible outcomes he had available to him had just collapsed from a very large number to something very close to one. He stood there, handcuffs in his hand, radio in the other, and could not move in any direction that led anywhere good. Cole was speaking into the phone again. "Ronald." "Yes, thank you for picking up. I apologize for the intrusion on your evening. I am currently at Hargrove's Chop House on Abercorn Street. I am having dinner with Commander Marcus Webb to celebrate his promotion to 05. A pause. "Thank you. I will pass that along. However, we have a significant problem. One of your patrol officers, an Officer D." Pruitt, badge number 714, entered this restaurant approximately 10 minutes ago. Bypassed the staff who could have verified Commander Webb's alibi. Ignored the commander's calm and legally accurate assertion of his constitutional rights. Drew his handcuffs, announced a false arrest on fabricated charges, and was about to physically drag him from his seat. When I returned from the lobby, another pause, longer this time. "Yes, Ronald? Commander Webb is an active-duty federal officer. The dining room has been recording this interaction from multiple angles for the last several minutes." Cole looked at Pruitt, not with contempt, with something colder. The clinical assessment of a man cataloging the dimensions of a problem he is already in the process of solving. "We will remain exactly where we are." "Thank you, Ronald. No sirens, please. These people have had their dinner disturbed enough for one evening." He lowered the phone and slipped it back into his jacket. "Chief Stokes is on his way," Cole said to no one in particular. "He will be bringing Captain Donna Marsh from Internal Affairs. They were at the Savannah Police Foundation Gala 4 blocks from here. They should arrive in approximately 5 minutes. Marcus, who had not moved from his seat through any of this, finally shifted forward slightly. He rested his forearms on the edge of the table. He looked at Derek Pruitt, not with anger, with something closer to sorrow. "Officer Pruitt." His voice was conversational, the voice of a man discussing the weather or the score of a game or any other subject that did not carry the weight of what was actually happening. In my line of work, we call what you just did a fatal funnel. Pruitt blinked. You walked into an environment you had not assessed. You made assumptions based on incomplete intelligence. You committed to an action without an exit strategy. and you trapped yourself in a position where every available move makes your situation worse. He tilted his head slightly. The dispatch call this evening was for a suspect fleeing northbound on foot. You found a man sitting in a corner booth eating soup and waiting for his dinner guest. You did not investigate. You hunted. You hunted because you believed my skin color made me an easy target. You believed a dark suit and a dark face meant you could exert dominance without consequence. He held Pruitt's gaze. You chose the wrong man, and you chose the wrong night. Outside, through the thick glass windows of Hargrove's chop house, the deep thud of car doors closing echoed off the cobblestones. 3 unmarked black SUVs, no sirens. Their grille lights flashed in silent pulses of red and blue that painted the historic stonework of Abercorn Street in stuttering neon. The heavy oak front door of the restaurant swung open with a force that suggested urgency without being theatrical about it. Chief Ronald Stokes walked in first. He was a broad, gray-haired man in his late 50s, dressed in a tuxedo with the bow tie already yanked loose and hanging around his neck, which communicated exactly how fast he had left the Police Foundation gala the moment General Cole's call had connected. His face was not red with embarrassment. It was red with fury. Behind him, moving with the brisk economical purpose of someone who had already assessed the situation from the description given over the phone and arrived with a plan, was Captain Donna Marsh. She was 50 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and sharp, watchful eyes. She had run the Savannah Police Department's Internal Affairs Division for 6 years. She had a reputation for being the most dangerous person in any room she entered, not because of her rank, but because of her absolute refusal to look away from things that inconvenienced people who expected her to. Behind her came 2 patrol sergeants from the Special Operations Unit, who had apparently been serving as the chief's informal escort at the gala. The room seemed to rearrange itself around these new arrivals. Stokes moved directly toward General Cole, completely bypassing Pruitt as though he did not exist. General Cole. Stokes extended his hand. "It is an absolute privilege, sir, and I cannot begin to express my apologies for what has taken place here tonight." "Chief." Cole shook the hand. He gestured toward the booth. "This is Commander Webb." Stokes turned to Marcus. He did not extend a hand because Marcus had not stood, and Stokes had enough understanding of the room to recognize that asking the man who had just been subjected to a false arrest attempt to rise from his seat would be exactly the wrong thing to do. "Commander Webb, thank you for your service to this country. I am deeply, profoundly sorry that this happened in my city on my department's watch." Marcus nodded once. "Thank you, Chief." Stokes turned. He turned slowly, with the deliberate finality of a very large mechanism coming around to point at something. He looked at Derek Pruitt. In 14 years, Pruitt had been looked at by a lot of people in a lot of ways. He had never been looked at like this. Pruitt. Stokes' voice was so controlled it was almost quiet. "That was the part that was frightening. I have read your file. I have read every complaint in it. I have watched the Union protect you from consequences you deserved more times than I care to count." He stepped closer. "But none of those complaints included attempting to physically assault an active-duty federal officer in front of 4 dozen witnesses and a 4-star general. Chief, I can explain." "Shut your mouth." The 2 words landed like a door slamming. Pruitt shut his mouth. Captain Marsh had already moved. She walked to a position directly in front of Pruitt the way a surgeon approaches a procedure, without drama, without hesitation, with the efficiency of someone who has done this and considers it simply a task to be completed. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed a pair of zip ties. Not metal handcuffs, zip ties. It was not an accident. Zip ties were faster, yes, but in this context, in this room for this man, they also meant something. They meant the professional courtesies that usually accompany the processing of a law enforcement officer were not going to be extended tonight. Officer Pruitt, under the authority of Chief Ronald Stokes, you are hereby stripped of your police powers effective immediately. Surrender your service weapon. Surrender your radio. Surrender your taser. Surrender your badge. Pruitt's hands had begun to shake, not slightly, visibly. With fingers that could barely execute the task, he unclipped his radio from his shoulder and placed it on the empty table beside Marcus's booth. He unbuckled his duty belt. The whole assembly, the gun, the taser, the extra magazine, pouches, the baton ring, all of it dropped against the plush carpet with a heavy final thud. And then his fingers moved to his chest. He unpinned the silver shield, the badge that had been for 14 years the physical embodiment of everything he believed himself to be, the thing that gave him permission, the thing that made him feel like he mattered, the thing that had protected him from every consequence he had ever deserved. He held it out. Marsh took it from his fingers. She did not look at it. She placed it in her jacket pocket without ceremony. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. He turned. The zip ties went on. The sound of the plastic ratcheting tight traveled across the silent dining room with perfect clarity. You are being temporarily detained, pending a full internal affairs investigation, Marsh said, for civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and attempted assault of a federal officer. She glanced at Stokes. He nodded once. You will be transported to headquarters. She looked at Pruitt. Your pension is suspended pending review. Your certification is suspended pending review. Your employment status is suspended pending review. The two operations sergeants moved in, one on each side of Pruitt. As he was walked toward the front door of Hargrove's Chop House past the tables of people who had witnessed everything, past the servers who had been frozen in place for the last 15 minutes with trays balanced on their arms, past Franklin, the host who stood aside and watched with an expression he did not try to hide. A sound began. From near the back of the dining room, a single pair of hands. An older man in a tweed jacket, the same man who had been reading a newspaper at a table by the window when this evening began. He started clapping. Not loud, not theatrical, just steady, deliberate applause. And then the woman at the next table joined. And then the couple who had been arguing and then were not. And then the group of four near the fireplace. And then, one by one, the entire dining room of Hargrove's Chop House gave a quiet, sustained round of applause as Officer Derek Pruitt was walked out through the front door, stripped of everything he had used to define himself, into the warm September night. The door swung shut behind him. The room held the silence for 3 long seconds. Then the jazz resumed soft and unhurried as though it had never stopped. Chief Stokes turned back to the booth. Gentlemen, please finish your dinner. The meal is on the city tonight. Captain Marsh will reach out tomorrow to take your formal statements at your convenience. He looked at Marcus. There was something in the chief's eyes that was not simply professional regret. It was the look of a man who had spent many years telling himself that bad apples were isolated incidents that the system corrected its own errors, that the complaints were exaggerated or complicated or not entirely what they appeared to be, and who was now looking at a man who had been subjected to 14 years of the thing he had been telling himself did not happen and could not look away from it any more. I am sorry, Commander Stokes said quietly. And then he left. The restaurant settled back into itself slowly, gradually, the way water settles after a stone is dropped. Franklin, the host, appeared at the table with a fresh bottle of wine. His hands trembled slightly as he poured. General Cole settled back into his seat. He picked up his glass. He looked at Marcus. The younger man had already resumed eating his soup. His posture was perfect. His expression was entirely composed. Cole said, his voice quiet. I spent 40 years in the United States military. I have seen things in war zones on 3 continents that would hollow out most men. But watching a sworn peace officer attempt to put his hands on you in your own city, in a place like this, on a night like this, he shook his head. It makes my blood boil in a completely different way. Marcus finished a spoonful of soup. He set the spoon down carefully. He looked at Cole. It is the reality of the world I move through, sir, he said. The uniform I wear when I deploy commands respect from everyone I encounter. But when I take it off to men like Pruitt, I am just a description on a radio call, a target of opportunity. He picked up his water glass. It should not be your reality, Cole said firmly. Marcus took a slow sip. As of tonight, he said, it will no longer be his. While Marcus Webb and General Cole finished their celebratory dinner in a room that felt, for the first time in 2 hours, like what it was supposed to be, Captain Donna Marsh did not go home. She had her driver take her directly from Hargrove's chop house to the police department's administrative building. She rode in silence the entire way, which her driver had learned over 2 years meant she was thinking very precisely about something and did not want to be interrupted. She walked into the Internal Affairs Records room at 10:47 in the evening. She did not turn on the overhead fluorescent lights. She turned on the desk lamp and pulled a chair and requested 3 separate files from the overnight clerk. Derek Pruitt's personnel file, his use of force history, his complete civilian complaint record. The clerk brought them within 4 minutes. He looked at the size of the files and did not comment. Marsh opened the first folder and began to read. She was a methodical reader. She did not skim. She had been doing this work long enough to know that the details other people glossed over were usually the ones that mattered. She read for 90 minutes without stopping. When she finally sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes, she had a precise and fully formed picture of 14 years of Derek Pruitt. The earliest complaint was from 11 years ago. A young man named James Colton, 22 years old, who had been stopped and physically searched without cause on the corner of MLK Boulevard, and had filed a written complaint with enough detail and coherence that it should have triggered a formal review. The review had been assigned, and then reassigned, and then quietly subsumed into a process that produced a finding of insufficient evidence 3 months later, at which point the complaint was filed, closed, and buried. The next one was 8 years ago, then 4 years ago, then 2. The pattern was unmistakable. The victims were almost uniformly black men between the ages of 20 and 50. Almost uniformly in the lower income districts on the south side of the city where Pruitt had spent the better part of his career doing what he did, protected by the knowledge that the people he was doing it to did not have the resources to fight it, and the people who were supposed to stop him had looked away so many times it had become a habit. Marsh was still reading when the door opened. Detective Marcus Santos from the Violent Crimes Division leaned in. He looked tired and apologetic. "Captain, the chief said you were taking point on the Pruitt situation." She looked up. "That's correct." He stepped into the room and placed a manila folder on the table. "I also have an update on the actual grand larceny at Whitmore Jewelers. The one Pruitt claimed gave him grounds for the stop tonight. Tell me, my guys caught the actual suspect about 6 blocks north of the jewelry store. He was found in an alley behind the dumpsters at Forsyth Park. He had a bag with him that contained 6 watches, 4 rings, and a broken display case latch from the front window." Marsh felt something sharpen in her chest. She already knew what was coming, but she needed to hear it said. "Describe the suspect." Santos opened the folder. Kyle Morrow. 17 years old. White male. He was wearing blue jeans, a light gray hoodie with a torn left sleeve, and red sneakers. He slid a photograph across the table. The 911 call from the jewelry store owner was actually very specific, Captain. She gave us height-build approximate age clothing description, including the hoodie and the red sneakers. The dispatch call condensed it to black male dark clothing heading northbound, which is how it sometimes gets passed along. He paused. But here's what matters. The full 911 transcript was available on every officer's in-car terminal within 4 minutes of the call being placed. Pruitt had access to the complete description before he ever got out of his vehicle. Marsh looked at the photograph. She looked at it for a long time, so he did not mishear the dispatch she said. Santos shook his head. He saw the abbreviated call. He saw a black man in a dark suit through the window of a restaurant, and he made a choice, Captain. He made a deliberate choice to ignore everything that did not support the conclusion he had already arrived at. Marsh closed the folder. She looked at the stacks of files in front of her. 11 complaints, 14 years. One clear documented pattern. And then she looked at the photograph of Kyle Morrow. 17 years old. Gray hoodie. Red sneakers. She reached for her phone. She called FBI Special Agent Patricia Wynn at 11:43 at night. Wynn answered on the second ring, which told Marsh something about the kind of person Patricia Wynn was. Patricia, this is Donna Marsh. I need to bring you in on something. Commander Marcus Webb active duty. United States Army Special Operations. Tonight, one of my officers attempted to unlawfully detain and assault him in a civilian establishment in front of multiple witnesses. I have the complete file in front of me, and I need to advise you that this officer's conduct tonight constitutes a federal offense under Title 18. She listened. Yes, I will have everything prepared. I will email the files tonight. The hearing is in 3 days. I think you should be in the room. She set the phone down. She looked at the files on the table. Then she picked up a pen and began making a list of every officer in Derek Pruitt's unit who had been present for any of the 11 complaints and had written a supporting statement. It was going to be a long night. And that was fine. Long nights had never bothered Donna Marsh. The disciplinary hearing took place on Monday morning, 3 days after the incident at Hargrove's Chop House. The conference room on the 4th floor of the municipal building was windowless. The table was long and mahogany. The air was stale with the particular flatness of a space that had absorbed too many difficult conversations. Derek Pruitt arrived in a gray suit that had not been pressed. He sat at one end of the table next to Thomas Vickers, the senior representative of the Savannah Police Benevolent Association, the police union. Vickers was a thick, pink-faced man in his early 60s who had made a career of being the last line of defense between bad officers and consequences. He was very good at his job in the way that a particular kind of person is very good at something that costs other people enormously. He did not look comfortable this morning. He had reviewed the footage from Hargrove's Chop House, all 8 angles of it. He had read the dispatch transcript. He had looked at the photograph of Kyle Morrow. He was not comfortable. Across the table sat Chief Ronald Stokes, Captain Donna Marsh, and at the far end of the table in a chair, she had positioned slightly away from the others, as though to indicate that she represented an entirely separate institutional authority. Special Agent Patricia Wynn of the FBI Civil Rights Division. Wynn was 48 years old. She wore a dark navy suit and carried a briefcase that contained a federal warrant she had obtained the previous afternoon from a magistrate judge who had reviewed the evidence and signed it in 11 minutes. Chief Stokes opened a thick binder. The sound of the spine cracking traveled across the table and landed in the silence. Derek Pruitt. We are here to formally address the internal affairs investigation into your conduct on the evening of Friday, the September 23rd. Are you prepared to hear the findings? Pruitt stared at the table. Yes, Chief. His voice was barely audible. Stokes nodded to Marsh. She slid a stack of documents and photographs across the table. Officer Pruitt, you entered the dining room of Hargrove's Chop House at approximately 8:17 in the evening. You claimed to be conducting a Terry stop based on a dispatch report that the Commander Marcus Webb matched the description of a suspect in the theft at Whitmore Jewelers. She paused. We have pulled the full 911 audio recorded by the jewelry store owner. We have pulled the dispatch logs. We have pulled the in-car terminal access record showing every piece of information transmitted to your vehicle in the 12 minutes before you entered the restaurant. She placed a photograph on the table. The photograph of Kyle Morrow. The actual suspect was apprehended at 11:12 on Friday evening. His name is Kyle Morrow. He is 17 years old. He is white. He was wearing a gray hoodie, blue jeans, and red sneakers. The jewelry store owner's 911 call described him with precision. That description was available to you on your in-car terminal before you got out of your vehicle. Pruitt was looking at his hands. I made an error in judgment, he said. It was dark. The call was abbreviated. I thought he matched. Do not lie to me in this room, Marsh said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The in-car terminal log shows you accessed the full 911 transcript at 8:11. The description of Kyle Morrow was available to you in complete detail 6 minutes before you walked into that restaurant. You did not make an error. You made a choice. The room was absolutely silent. Vickers cleared his throat. Captain Chief. My client acknowledges a serious lapse in judgment on the evening in question. Given his 14 years of service to this department, the union is prepared to accept a formal censure and an extended suspension without pay, accompanied by mandatory sensitivity training and a return-to-duty evaluation. Stokes looked at Vickers. He looked at him for long enough that Vickers stopped speaking and began to feel the silence as pressure. Thomas, let me stop you. Stokes's voice was measured and final. The union protected Officer Pruitt through 11 complaints over 14 years. I understand why you did that. I understand the institutional logic. But the union protects officers from departmental discipline. It does not protect officers from federal law. He looked at Wynne. She unfolded her hands from the table. Mr. Pruitt. Her voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of someone who has had this conversation enough times to have removed all urgency from it while losing none of its weight. Commander Marcus Webb is an active-duty officer of the United States Army. By attempting to unlawfully detain and assault him, you did not merely violate departmental policy. You committed a federal criminal offense under Title 18 United States Code Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Pruitt's head came up. His eyes moved to Vickers. Vickers was staring at the table. The union did not go to war against the FBI. He had known this since Friday night. He had been doing the calculation for 3 days. There was no version of this that the union could pull him out of. We have also reviewed your complete personnel file. Wynne continued. Captain Marsh has provided us with the full complaint history. We have identified a clear documented pattern of using your badge to target black male civilians to subject them to unlawful stops and searches, to use physical force without legal basis, and to submit reports that misrepresented the facts of those interactions. She leaned forward slightly. The people you did this to, Mr. Pruitt, in the neighborhoods on the south side of this city did not have the resources to fight you. They did not have a general to stand up behind them. So they filed complaints and watched them disappear. And you watched them disappear and concluded that you were protected. She let that land. You are not protected. and your reign of terror over this city's citizens ended the moment you put your hand on a United States Army Special Forces officer in front of a 4-star general. Chief Stokes closed the binder. The sound was definitive. Gregory Miller. He stopped, corrected himself. Derek Pruitt. Effective immediately, your employment with the Savannah Police Department is terminated. Your law enforcement certification is revoked. You will not work in law enforcement in this state or in any other state ever again. Your pension is frozen pending the outcome of civil proceedings. He stood. Agent Wynne has something else to tell you. Wynne stood as well. She nodded toward the door. The door opened. 2 FBI agents entered the conference room. They were large men in dark suits who moved with the deliberate efficiency of people for whom this was a procedure, not a confrontation. "Stand up, Mr. Pruitt." He stood. His legs were shaking. His entire body was shaking. The cheap gray suit was damp at the collar. "A federal warrant has been issued for your arrest. You are under federal indictment for deprivation of civil rights under color of law and attempted assault of a federal officer." The handcuffs went on. Real ones this time. Metal, heavy. The click of the ratchet mechanism was identical in sound to every set of handcuffs Derek Pruitt had ever closed around another person's wrists in 14 years. But the weight of them from this side was entirely different. He was walked toward the door. He passed Captain Marsh. She did not look at him. She was already opening the next file on the stack in front of her. He passed Chief Stokes. Stokes met his eyes once, then looked away. He was walked out of the conference room, out of the building, into the flat, gray light of a Monday morning in Savannah. There were no cameras waiting, no news vans, no crowd. Just the ordinary morning of a city that was still mostly asleep, going about the business of being alive, unaware that one small gear in its machinery had just been removed. The footage broke wide open by Tuesday afternoon. Someone in Hargrove's Chop House on the night of the incident had posted a 47-second clip to social media. It was not the most dramatic clip of the 8. It was one shot from a phone at the adjacent table, slightly shaky, focused on the moment Pruitt's hand reached toward the front of Marcus's jacket. On the left side of the frame, Marcus sat perfectly still, both hands flat on the table, his posture impeccable, his expression completely calm. On the right side, Pruitt's hand hovered in the air, reaching, and then the shadow of General Cole fell across the table, and Pruitt's hand dropped. That 47 seconds, that was all it took. By midnight on Tuesday, the clip had been viewed 11 million times. By Wednesday morning, every major network had the story. The Savannah Morning News broke the full account. The Associated Press picked it up. CNN ran the clip every 30 minutes on its morning broadcast. The contrast was the thing people could not stop looking at, could not stop sharing. A man who had served his country in war zones on 3 continents, sitting quietly in the finest restaurant in his city, celebrating a promotion. And a cop who had decided on the basis of his skin color that he did not belong there. The police union released a statement on Wednesday afternoon. It was 6 sentences long. It noted that the union could not ethically defend conduct captured on video from multiple angles and formally withdrew its legal support from Officer Pruitt. The news cycle absorbed this and kept moving. Marcus gave one brief statement through his attorney on Thursday. He thanked the patrons of Hargrove's Chop House for having the presence of mind to document what happened. He said he was grateful that the system in this instance had functioned the way it was supposed to. He said nothing else. He did not want to. He had a deployment briefing to prepare for. His team was waiting. The civil litigation moved faster than anyone expected. The city of Savannah's legal counsel reached out to Marcus's attorney within 2 weeks of the incident, which was itself an indication of how completely and thoroughly the footage had made the city's position untenable. The civil settlement was reached in 6 weeks. The terms were not disclosed. Captain Donna Marsh, meanwhile, had spent those 6 weeks doing the thing she had started on the night of the incident: pulling files, reading complaints, cross-referencing. She produced a report that was 43 pages long. It detailed the complaint histories of 8 additional officers who had operated in proximity to Pruitt over the course of his career, who had submitted supporting statements in his various complaint proceedings, and whose own records showed the distinctive fingerprints of similar behavior. Chief Stokes read the report on a Sunday. He read it twice. By the following Friday, 3 of the 8 officers had been placed on administrative leave pending formal IA review. 2 had resigned before the leave could be imposed. 1 had reached out to the FBI voluntarily through an attorney to inquire about cooperating with the federal investigation. The 2 remaining were under active review. The Savannah Police Department's use of force protocols were rewritten from scratch. Community Oversight Board access to complaint files was expanded. Body camera policies were restructured to eliminate the discretionary deactivation provisions that had allowed officers to control their own footage. None of this made the news the way the video had made the news. It was not 47 seconds of undeniable clarity. It was the slow, difficult, unglamorous work of institutions attempting to hold themselves accountable. It did not have the same emotional weight as the footage. But it was perhaps more important. 9 months after the evening at Hargrove's Chop House, the heavy oak doors of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Georgia opened on a Tuesday morning in June. The courtroom was full. Reporters filled the gallery. The air conditioning hummed efficiently. The federal marshals stood at their positions with the practiced stillness of people who have stood in courtrooms through many kinds of moments, and have learned not to anticipate what any of them means until it is over. At the defense table, Derek Pruitt sat in a dark suit that had been purchased specifically for this proceeding and already looked too large for him. 9 months had cost him 30 pounds. The bags under his eyes were deep and permanent. He held his hands clasped on the table in front of him and stared at the space between his thumbs. His wife had filed for divorce in February. She had taken the children to her sister's house in Columbia and had not come back. The house had been listed for sale to cover the legal fees. His former colleagues in the department had not testified for him. Several had testified against him. Officer Martinez, who had partnered with Pruitt for 3 years, had provided the federal prosecutors with a detailed account of the operational culture of their unit, the way certain behaviors were tolerated, the way certain complaints were collectively understood to be things you did not discuss. The jury had heard all of it. The jury had deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes. In the front row of the gallery, Marcus Webb sat in his full Army service dress uniform. His left breast was heavy with decorations: a bronze star, a purple heart, 3 commendations for valor in combat operations. The gold oak leaves of his newly confirmed 05 rank gleamed on his collar. Beside him, upright and still as a monolith, sat General Raymond Cole. Neither of them spoke. They had said everything that needed to be said. Judge Eleanor Weston took the bench. The room rose, the room sat. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked at Derek Pruitt. "Mr. Pruitt." Her voice was clear and entirely without sentiment. "The jury has found you guilty on all counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, attempted assault of a federal officer, 14 counts of documented civil rights violations drawn from the established pattern of conduct presented by the prosecution." She paused. "Before I pass sentence, is there anything you wish to say?" Pruitt stood. He had to grip the edge of the defense table to manage it. He looked across the courtroom, at the rows of people who had come to watch, at the reporters with their legal pads, at the federal marshals, at Marcus. Marcus did not look away from him. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. The man he had reached for in a restaurant 9 months ago, who had sat with his hands flat on the table and looked back at him with an expression that was not fear. He understood now what that expression had been. He looked down at the table. "I am deeply sorry." His voice cracked on the second word and did not fully recover. "I made a terrible mistake. I have lost my career. I have lost my family. I have lost everything I thought I was. I ask the court for mercy." Judge Weston waited for him to finish. Then she looked at him for a long moment over the top of her glasses. "Mr. Pruitt." Her voice did not change. "A mistake is misreading a map. A mistake is a filing error. What you did that evening was not a mistake. It was a choice. A choice rooted in the belief that your badge gave you the right to determine which citizen deserved the protections of the law and which did not. That belief did not arrive on the night of September 23rd. It was present for 14 years. It was present in 11 complaints. It was present every time you targeted someone who did not have the means to stop you. She folded her hands on the bench. Commander Webb did not become a different person because of what he had done in service to this country. He was a citizen before he was a soldier. His rights did not depend on his rank. They depended on nothing except that he was a person living in a society that had made an agreement with itself about how its members would be treated. You violated that agreement. Not once, not by accident, but repeatedly, deliberately, and with the confidence of a man who believed he would never face consequences. You were wrong. She picked up her gavel. "Derek Pruitt, it is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve a term of 90 months, 7.5 years. This sentence will be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from any position in law enforcement security or any profession requiring a state licensure that involves authority over other persons. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals." The gavel came down. The sound of it in the quiet courtroom was definitive. The 2 federal marshals moved in. They took Pruitt by the arms. The handcuffs went on for the last time. He did not look back as they walked him toward the side door. The door closed behind him. The courtroom exhaled. In the front row, General Cole turned his head and looked at Marcus. Neither of them smiled. This was not a moment for celebration. "It was done," Cole said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir, it is." They sat for a moment longer, the noise of the room beginning to rise around them, reporters moving, people standing, the ordinary machinery of a public moment, resuming its regular operation. Then they stood. They walked out of the courtroom together through the wide corridor of the federal building, through the heavy glass doors, and into the June sunlight on the steps of the courthouse. The media was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Cameras, microphones, reporters calling questions. Marcus walked past them. He had no statement to give. He had said everything he was going to say by sitting in that courtroom in his uniform with his decorations on his chest and letting the proceedings speak for themselves. He had a briefing in 2 hours. His team was gathering. In 3 weeks, he would be somewhere that he could not name publicly, doing work that mattered in ways that would not appear in any newspaper. At the bottom of the steps, Cole paused. He put a hand on Marcus's shoulder, just briefly. "You handled every moment of this exactly the way I would have expected," he said. Marcus looked at him. He thought briefly of the restaurant, of the corner booth, of his hands flat on the white linen tablecloth, of the moment Pruitt's hand had reached for his jacket, of the choice he had made in that moment to hold completely still and let the truth be the thing that moved. "I had good training, sir," he said. Cole let out a short, quiet sound that was as close as he came to a laugh. "He will, Commander," he said. "He will." They walked toward the parking structure together, leaving the cameras and the reporters and the aftermath of everything in the bright June light behind them. Marcus Webb had a mission to prepare for. The men he led were waiting, and there was always more work to be done. The 8 months that followed the sentencing were quieter than the months before it. Captain Donna Marsh finalized her departmental report in August. Of the 8 officers she had flagged, 4 had been formally dismissed. 2 had resigned. 1 had cooperated with federal investigators and received a reduced administrative consequence. 1 remained under review, a process Marsh had every intention of seeing to its conclusion. Chief Stokes announced a partnership with the Savannah Community Oversight Board that gave civilian representatives direct, unrestricted access to internal affairs files and complaint histories. It was not perfect. Nothing like this ever is on the first attempt. But it was something that had not existed before the evening of September 23rd. The use of force report reform went into effect in January. Body camera footage was now automatically uploaded to a secure server at the end of every shift beyond the reach of any individual officer. Deactivation required written justification submitted within 24 hours, reviewable by Marsh's office at any time. At Whitmore Jewelers on Congress Street, the owner replaced the front window display case that Kyle Morrow had broken, and did not think about that night very often. Kyle Morrow entered a juvenile diversion program in October. The program lasted 6 months. He completed it without incident. Franklin, the host at Hargrove's Chop House, kept Table 7 in the corner, reserved on Friday evenings throughout the fall. He did not explain to anyone why. The reservation was made under no name. He simply kept the table clear. The brass lamp lit a glass of sparkling water set, and the space available in the event that someone who had earned a quiet dinner might want to return for one. In late November, on a Friday evening, they did. Marcus came alone. Cole was traveling. The dinner was just Marcus, the corner booth, the soft jazz, and the she-crab soup he had never gotten to finish on the night that had changed the trajectory of several lives. Franklin brought the soup without being asked. Marcus looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the spoon and ate his dinner in complete, unhurried peace. Outside on Abercorn Street, the cobblestones still caught the amber light of the old-style lampposts. The Spanish moss still swayed in the September breeze that had stretched somehow all the way into late fall. The city moved around the restaurant with the ordinary noise of ordinary life, the way cities do, indifferent to individual moments, even the ones that mattered enormously. Marcus finished his soup. He ordered the ribeye. He sat in the corner booth for 2.5 hours and let himself be exactly what he was, a man in his city, at a table in a restaurant doing nothing wrong, belonging entirely to the place where he sat. Before he left, he asked Franklin to take his name off the standing reservation. "There are other people who should have the table," he said. Franklin nodded. "Of course, Commander." Marcus left a generous tip put on his coat and walked out into the Savannah night. True power does not announce itself. It does not require a performance. It does not need to take from someone else in order to feel real. Marcus Webb had known that for a long time. He had learned it in hard places, under hard circumstances, from men who led by the force of their character rather than the volume of their voice. What happened at Hargrove's Chop House on a September evening was not a story about the exception. It was a story about the rule. The rule that says that dignity is not earned by the uniform you wear or the rank you hold or the people standing behind you when the moment comes. It is simply the thing you are owed by virtue of being a person in the world. Marcus Webb already knew that. He had never stopped knowing it. And on that November night, walking through the warm glow of the lampposts on Abercorn Street, he allowed himself the quiet, private knowledge that the accounting had been settled. Not perfectly, nothing ever is, but completely enough. If stories like this one matter to you, if you believe that dignity and accountability should mean something, subscribe to our channel. There are more stories like this one, and they deserve to be told. But before that night in November, before the sentencing, before the federal indictment, before the footage broke across every network in the country, there was a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October. Marcus sat in a small conference room on the 4th floor of his attorney's office building on Bull Street. His attorney was a woman named Celeste Drummond. She was 53 years old, had been practicing civil rights law in Georgia for 22 years, and had the particular quality of people who have spent decades fighting difficult battles on behalf of people who should not have had to fight them. She was not excitable. She had seen too much for excitability to serve her, but she was focused always. And on this Tuesday afternoon she was focused the way a laser is focused. On the table between them was a stack of documents that Donna Marsh's office had provided through the formal discovery process. The 11 complaints, the 14 use-of-force reports, the financial records of the settlements the city had paid quietly to the people Pruitt had harmed. Marcus had read all of it. He had taken 2 days to do it. He had read it the way he read mission briefings, carefully, without hurrying, allowing each detail to settle before moving to the next. Some of it was difficult to read, not because the individuals described in the files were strangers, but because they were not. James Colton stopped and searched 11 years ago, 22 years old at the time, currently 33, an electrician in the Ardsley Park neighborhood. He had a wife and 2 children. He had filed his complaint carefully and precisely, and watched it disappear. Marcus looked at the photograph in James Colton's file. Then he looked at his own hands on the table. He thought about the corner booth, the white linen tablecloth. His hands flat on the fabric, visible, deliberate. He thought about how many people had put their hands out in a gesture of compliance, in a gesture of honesty, in a gesture of good faith, and had still been given nothing in return. He thought about his uniform, the thing General Cole had been talking about at the table in Hargrove's chop house. The uniform I wear when I deploy commands respect. When I take it off to men like Pruitt, I am just a description on a radio call. He had said that calmly, because it was simply true, because he had moved through the world long enough to know it with absolute precision. But sitting in Celeste Drummond's conference room surrounded by 11 complaints that had been buried, he felt the full weight of what that truth cost. Not for himself, for James Colton, for the others in those files, for the people who had tried and been told in the language of closed files and insufficient evidence findings that their experience of this city did not matter as much as the union contract of the man who had caused it. He closed the folder. He looked at Drummond. "The civil settlement offer came in yesterday evening," she said. Her voice was even. "I would like you to understand it fully before you decide anything." She slid a document across the table. He read it twice. It was substantial, more than he had expected. The city's legal team had clearly looked at 8 angles of footage and done their own calculation of what the cost of a trial would be. It reflected in the language of numbers the gap between what Derek Pruitt had believed he could get away with and the reality of what a room full of people with smartphones and a 4-star general as a witness actually made possible. He set the document down. What does accepting this mean for the other cases? For the 11 complaints? Drummond had been expecting this question. Your acceptance of a civil settlement does not affect the federal criminal prosecution, she said. That proceeds independently. It also does not affect the departmental review Captain Marsh is conducting. The 8 officers under review are being investigated regardless of your civil case. She paused. However, there is something else. I have been in contact with the attorneys representing 3 of Pruitt's previous victims, including James Colton. They have separate civil actions that have been dormant for years because their clients did not have the resources to push them forward. She folded her hands on the table. Your case has changed the evidentiary landscape significantly. The documentation from Marsh's office, the dispatch, transcripts, the footage from the restaurant, the federal indictment. All of that is now part of the public record. Their attorneys believe they can revive those cases with a substantially stronger position. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Good. He said it simply, without emphasis. The way you say a thing that is simply correct. Accept the settlement. And make sure Drummond Associates is willing to serve as co-counsel to the others at whatever rate allows them to actually proceed. Drummond made a note. She had expected this too. She had read his file before their first meeting. She had understood before they ever sat down together what kind of person she was representing. The settlement paperwork was signed on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus did not feel relief when it was done. He felt something quieter, something closer to the feeling that comes at the end of a very long mission when you have done what you went to do and the men who went with you have all come back. It was not triumph, it was completion. There were other moments in those 9 months that did not make the news. There was a Monday morning in December when Donna Marsh drove to the south side of Savannah to a neighborhood of narrow streets and small houses with careful front yards, and knocked on the door of a man named James Colton. He opened the door in a work shirt with a logo on the pocket, clearly on his way out. He looked at her badge. His face closed. She understood why. She understood it completely, and she had spent the drive over thinking about how to say what she had come to say. Mr. Colton. My name is Donna Marsh. I am the head of internal affairs for the Savannah Police Department. I am here because 11 years ago you filed a complaint against an officer named Derek Pruitt, and I am here to tell you that the complaint was never properly investigated. That the conclusion of insufficient evidence was not based on a real examination of what you described, and that I am sorry for that. She said it. She did not qualify it. She did not add context or institutional explanation. She just said it. James Colton stood in his doorway and looked at her for a long time. He was 33 years old. He had been 22 when he had stood on a street corner and tried to tell someone in authority what had been done to him, and been told in the language of process that it did not matter. He looked at her badge, then at her face, then past her at the street. The things people feel in moments like this are not simple. They are not simply relief, because relief suggests the wound has closed, and this wound had been open for 11 years. They are not simply anger. Because anger at what? Exactly in this moment, at the woman standing on the doorstep, at the department, at the 11 years, at all of it at once in a way that is too large to direct at any particular thing. What James Colton felt was something closer to exhaustion and something else that did not have a clean name. He nodded once. He said, I know. And then thank you for coming to tell me. And then he went to work. Marsh drove back to her office. She sat at her desk and did not speak to anyone for 20 minutes. Then she opened the next file. By the time Marcus Webb shipped out in December, Savannah had changed in small, specific ways that did not make for easy headlines, but that people who lived there and paid attention could feel. The Community Oversight Board was holding its first open session. 3 officers who had resigned rather than face the IA review had quietly moved to other jurisdictions. Marsh had notified those jurisdictions' departments in writing of the circumstances of their departure. This was not required by law. It was required in Marsh's view by simple obligation. Hargrove's Chop House remained one of the finest restaurants in Savannah. The food was exactly what it had always been. The chandeliers cast the same amber warmth across the same mahogany walls. Table 7 was still a corner booth half hidden in the soft glow of a brass table lamp. In January, it was occupied on a Friday night by a young couple celebrating an engagement. In February, a retired schoolteacher sat there alone and ordered the soup and the ribeye and 2 glasses of a Cabernet she had been saving the occasion for the better part of 3 years. In March, a group of 4 old friends who had been meeting for dinner at Hargrove's Chop House for 15 years sat at the table 7 for the first time because Franklin, the host, had offered it to them and they took it. The table was just a table. It meant what tables mean, that someone was welcome here, that they could sit, that they could eat, that the place where they were was a place where they were allowed to be. That was not a small thing. It was, depending on how you looked at it, the whole thing. Marcus Webb came home in late April. He did not announce his return. He drove from the airport in a rental car with the windows down, letting the warm Georgia air move through the vehicle. He drove through the city, past the live oaks and the Spanish moss, past the squares with their monuments and their benches, past the streets where he had walked since he was a boy in this city, navigating the particular geography of a place that had loved him and made him feel unwanted, and loved him again in the complicated, unresolved way that most places do when you have been there long enough to know all of it. He drove down Abercorn Street. He slowed as he passed Hargrove's Chop House. The lights were on inside. The dinner service was in full swing. He did not stop. He drove on. He went home. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and called his mother in Augusta and talked to her for an hour and 20 minutes about nothing important. The temperature in April. The garden she was putting in along the back fence. The neighbor's dog that kept getting through the gate. Nothing important, which meant everything. The Pruitt case remained in the news intermittently through the spring. The appeals process was slow and produced nothing. The arguments that had been made in the trial held up exactly as well upon review as they had the first time. By summer, the story had moved to the background of the news cycle the way stories do when the immediate drama has resolved, and the longer, slower work of a consequence is all that remains. Pruitt was at the Federal Correctional Facility in Jessup, Georgia, a minimum security campus where former law enforcement officers were housed in a separate unit from the general population. He was 45 years old. He would be 53 when he was eligible for release. He had a job in the facility kitchen. He prepared food for the other inmates in his unit. He started at 6 in the morning and finished at 2 in the afternoon. He did not speak often. He had spent 14 years in Savannah wielding authority over other people. In Jessup, he had no authority. He was simply a man in a minimum security facility in southeast Georgia, preparing food, serving time, facing what he had done in the specific, inescapable way that only total quietness makes possible. Whether that produced anything in him that could honestly be called reflection, or whether it merely produced resentment that had nowhere left to go, is a question only Pruitt could answer. And whatever he arrived at in those quiet mornings in the kitchen, the world outside the facility walls continued its work without reference to his conclusions. Marcus Webb was promoted to 05 at a ceremony in May. General Cole attended. They stood on a bright morning in the courtyard of the army post, and there was a brief formality, and then it was done. Afterward, Cole said dinner, and Marcus said yes, sir. They went to Hargrove's Chop House. They sat at table 7. Franklin, the host, brought sparkling water and the 1998 Cabernet without being asked. They talked for 3 hours. About the work, about the people they had served with, about the places they had been and the things they had seen, about what it meant to do a thing long enough that it becomes the deepest expression of who you are. At the end of the evening, Marcus sat back in the corner booth and looked at the room around him. The chandeliers, the mahogany, the soft jazz, the murmur of conversation from tables full of people who were simply here eating, talking, being present in the ordinary, unremarkable, entirely irreplaceable way that people are present when they are allowed to simply be. "There is something worth protecting in all of this," he said. Cole looked at him. "All of it," Marcus clarified. "The ordinary part. The part that happens when nothing goes wrong. That is the thing worth protecting." Cole raised his glass. "That is always the thing worth protecting." They finished their wine. They paid the bill. They walked out into the warm Georgia night, into the amber light of the lampposts on Abercorn Street, and went their separate ways. The city continued. The way cities do. The way cities must. The federal trial itself lasted 4 days. 4 days of testimony evidence, and the slow, methodical dismantling of every defense Derek Pruitt's attorneys had constructed over the 9 months since his arrest. The defense had tried 3 separate narratives. The first was confusion. He had heard an abbreviated dispatch call. He had acted in good faith. Anyone might have made the same assessment in the same circumstances. That argument collapsed on the second morning when the prosecution introduced the in-car terminal log showing that Pruitt had accessed the full 911 transcript 6 minutes before entering the restaurant. His attorneys moved on. The second narrative was procedure. He had followed established Terry stop protocols. The stop was legally initiated. The escalation was a response to non-compliance. That argument collapsed when Celeste Drummond, sitting in the gallery as a public observer, watched the prosecution's use of force expert take the jury through step by step every procedural requirement for a lawful Terry stop, and identify point by point every place where Pruitt had deviated from it. The third narrative was the most desperate. It was the suggestion that Marcus Webb had been the one who escalated the situation, that his refusal to immediately produce identification had forced Pruitt's hand, that his calm, measured assertion of his legal rights was itself a form of resistance that a reasonable officer could interpret as threatening. This argument did not survive the footage from the restaurant. 8 angles, Marcus with his hands flat on the table, his posture easy, his expression neutral, a man eating dinner. The jury watched all of it. They watched Pruitt's hand reach for Marcus's jacket. They watched Cole's shadow fall across the table. They watched Pruitt's face in the moment he understood who was standing behind him. Then they were shown the personnel file, the 11 complaints, the settlements, the pattern. 3 witnesses from Pruitt's complaint history were allowed to testify. James Colton was one of them. He sat in the witness chair in a dark jacket and tie. He was 33 years old and calm. He described what had happened 11 years ago with the particular precision of a person who has never been able to forget a single detail of a thing that should not have happened to them. The jury listened. Nobody on the defense team objected very often. There was very little to object to. The facts were the facts. The footage was the footage. The pattern was the pattern. On the 4th afternoon, the jury went out. Marcus sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Cole and drank coffee that was not very good and did not talk very much. Cole read a paper version of the Wall Street Journal that someone had left on the table. Marcus looked at his phone and read a situation report from his team about a logistical matter that would need his attention when he returned. They were simply two people in a cafeteria waiting for something to finish. 4 hours and 12 minutes after the jury had gone out, the bailiff appeared in the cafeteria doorway. They went back into the courtroom. The foreman of the jury was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She stood. She read each count in turn. Guilty, 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 on all 14 counts. The courtroom absorbed the verdict in a particular way that courtrooms have a collective release of held breath that travels through a room like a change in air pressure. Pruitt's attorneys leaned toward him and spoke in low voices. He sat very still and listened to them and did not appear to fully register what they were saying. Marcus stood. He straightened his uniform jacket. He looked at the defense table once. Not with satisfaction, not with triumph. With something much simpler than either. He had come to this room because this was where the process led. The process was complete. He was ready for what came next. The weeks between the verdict and the sentencing were quieter than the weeks before it. Marcus reported to his unit. He sat in briefings. He reviewed personnel files for the team he was building. He ran in the mornings on the post track in the early dark, 5 miles in the particular silence of pre-dawn that has always been his preferred time to think. He thought about James Colton sitting in the witness chair. About the 3 days Celeste Drummond had spent preparing him for testimony and how he had sat through that process with the patience of a man who had been waiting 11 years for someone to actually listen. He thought about Donna Marsh driving to the south side of Savannah on a Monday morning to knock on a door. He thought about the 8 officers under review. The ones who had seen Pruitt do what he did and had submitted supporting statements rather than truths. He thought about the young officer Walsh, who had been Pruitt's partner for 2 of those 14 years, and had come to Drummond's office voluntarily in October with a written statement about what he had witnessed. Not because he had been required to, because he had decided that silence was a form of participation he could no longer live with. Walsh was 26 years old. He would carry what he had witnessed for the rest of his career. Whether that weight would make him a better officer or a worse one was a question only time could answer. But the fact that he had made the choice to speak was the beginning of something. It had to be. Otherwise, none of this meant anything beyond the individual case. And the individual case, important as it was only the surface of a much deeper thing. Marcus knew this. He had always known this. He ran his 5 miles in the dark and thought about all of it, and arrived back at his quarters in the pre-dawn quiet, and showered and changed, and went to his first briefing of the day. He had work to do. He had always had work to do. That had not changed. What had changed was something underneath it. Something quieter and more durable than the noise of the trial and the verdict, and the 9 months of the proceedings that had led to this particular June morning. Something that had to do with the corner booth, and the white linen tablecloth, and the decision to sit still, and let the truth be the thing that spoke. He could not name it exactly, but he carried it. The way you carry the things that have cost you something real, and given you something real in return. He carried it forward, into the next briefing, into the next mission, into every room he would walk into for the rest of his life as a man who had refused in a restaurant in Savannah on a September evening to become something less than he was. That was not nothing. That was in the end the whole thing. There are moments in a life that become reference points, not because they are the loudest, not because they draw the most attention or produce the most visible consequences, but because they reveal with sudden and complete clarity exactly who you are when the pressure is real and the cost is real and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. For Marcus Webb, the corner booth at Hargrove's Chop House was one of those moments, not because he had done anything extraordinary there. He had sat at a table. He had placed his hands flat on the cloth. He had spoken calmly and accurately about his legal rights to a man who had not wanted to hear it. He had held still, that was all. And yet, the practice of holding still when everything in the environment is designed to make you react, to make you show fear, to make you take the bait being offered, is not a passive thing. It is one of the most active choices a person can make. Marcus had learned it in places where the cost of the wrong reaction was measured in lives. He had learned it from men who understood that the most dangerous thing in a difficult situation is not the threat itself, but the decision you make in the first 3 seconds after encountering it. He had brought that learning home with him, into the restaurants and the grocery stores and the parking lots and the streets of the city where he had grown up and come home to and chosen repeatedly and deliberately to call his own. He had brought it into the corner booth. And because he had held still and held clear and let the situation reveal itself, rather than reacting to what it appeared to be the truth, had room to become visible. General Cole had seen it. Franklin, the host, had seen it. 8 people with smartphones had seen it. A jury of 12 people in a federal courthouse 9 months later had seen the footage and understood it. James Colton had sat in a witness chair and added 11 years of his own truth to it. And something, not everything, not as much as it should have been or needs to be, but something real and documentable and lasting had changed. Marcus Webb did not need anyone to tell him this meant he had won. He understood that the word winning was not really the right word for what had happened. What had happened was closer to accounting. A long overdue accounting of a specific debt that had been accumulating under the cover of closed files and union contracts and insufficient evidence findings for 14 years. The accounting was now complete. It would never undo what had already been paid. James Colton's 22-year-old self standing on a corner 11 years ago would always have stood there. The other people in those 11 files would always have been those people in those moments with no general standing behind them. That was the part that did not resolve. That was the part that never resolves cleanly, no matter how correct the accounting, no matter how thorough the consequence. Marcus knew this. He carried it. He would carry it. But he would also carry this, that on a September evening in Savannah he had sat in a corner booth with his hands flat on a white tablecloth, and had been exactly who he was and had not been moved. And that had been enough. That had been in the end everything.